Now, today, everyone, we are going to be looking at dyspraxia, or DCD, as people on the streets call it, and we're going to be looking at the history of it. What is it? Where did it come from? And it's quite an interesting one. It's no fidgety feel like we had on ADHD, but still interesting. As always, we're doing educational webinars to help educate the ND population. Could be really interesting to see how you think this could benefit. I do find the more you understand the historical context of, say, a condition or any moment in history can really help give you a level of grounding. For instance, why have I always seen dyspraxia as a negative growing up? History has set me up for failure. And when you understand the change of history, you do see that things are genuinely getting better. Let's face it, the world kinda sucks at times. But we are the best we've ever been in history. Less deaths, less wars, more support. It's pretty amazing. So I do find history can be a bit depressing, but also can be quite uplifting when you look at the general trend. And that's part of the reason about looking at today. Are we just a clumsy child? Are we someone who bangs our heads, falls on the floor, can't tie our laces? Or are we someone with a unique set of skill sets that is completely valuable to an organisation? That is where we're going today. Now, I actually have dyspraxia, so expert via experience, as well as an official professional now. I get my master's certificate in the post within 2 to 3 months. Today, we are looking at dyspraxia, or DCD. I mean, it has so many names. What's with all the naming? Just like the history of autism, ADHD, dyslexia, we can't make up our mind what it's called. But more so than that, we can't even make up our mind what exactly it is. Is the dyspraxia of yesteryear the same as dyspraxia today? It's had maybe similar names, completely different. It's had different names, but rather similar. And we're going to be pulling it apart. Why is it called DCD, Developmental Coordination Disorder, and called dyspraxia? Why is it also called Clumsy disorder or Clumsy syndrome? These are some of the things we're going to be exploring. Here's a picture of me looking very dyspraxic. I didn't tie my buttons very well, didn't iron the shirt. I was all over the place. And just, in terms of my own story of dyspraxia, I was diagnosed, I think about 3, because you can get diagnosed quite early for it. And I have been extremely uncoordinated, notoriously bad at sports. Just to be clarified, it's not that you are necessarily bad at sports if you have dyspraxia, but because you find coordination inherently more challenging, you're more likely to gravitate away from areas which require it, particularly those in competitive settings. I'm a competitive person, and I'm not going to set myself up for failure. If I had the chance, hey, Nat, do you want to play some football? I'm going to do terrible. So I would move away from it and put my time and effort in other areas. So that's the link. Also doing buttons, shoelaces, everything's taken me years to go. Velcro, what an amazing invention. It also meant that I had speech delay, which is closely entwined, because the movements to get your words out can take a little bit longer to learn. So, Developmental Coordination Disorder History. It's a bit of a mouthful, and the reason I guess we're calling it DCD is you could say it's more of an official term. I would say it's more of an American official term. For instance, in the UK, even clinicians or practitioners still tend to use the word dyspraxia. More and more, we're seeing DCD as the official word, and dyspraxia is like slang. Because the problem with dyspraxia is it can mean multiple things. If you go to a doctor and you say, I've got dyspraxia, that could mean multiple things. It can also relate to brain injuries, for example. So we don't want to get these things muddled up, hence why we normally separate them. In terms of a triad, though it's not as an official triad of impairments like we had in autism, more or less it's made up of motor coordination, how our body moves around. We've also got sensory processing, so the world around us, very relatable to those on the autistic spectrum, can struggle with sensory information. And also planning and organisation. So if you have difficulties in all these areas, possibly, maybe, you just might have dyspraxia. Now let's look at the earliest description we know. Let's go all the way back to the caveman time. No, dyspraxia is actually very modern. It's, this is why when you ask people, have you heard of it? No one's ever heard of dyspraxia. And I guess because it's relatively new. Let's go back to the early 1900s. Originally, it wasn't called dyspraxia. It was by James Stanfield Collier. Apparently, you cannot get a photo of this geezer. I looked through the whole internet. If anyone knows what this person looks like, let me know.
Congenital maladroitness.
Now, this was the OG DCD/dyspraxia. I want to know, is this dyspraxia? Because, in theory, dyspraxia has been known about for about 100 years. But what we used to know it as to what we know now is significantly different. In the 20th century, what a great century, this is where it gets quite interesting. Originally, all the way ago, from 100 years ago, we've been calling it clumsy child syndrome. Clumsy child syndrome is offensive, to be honest, but it has been known that for a really long time. So history, just clumsy child syndrome. DCD or dyspraxia, only a tiny part of history, hence why the name has stuck around. All the way since the 1925s, Samuel T. Orton took a real interest in understanding, or he didn't know it was dyspraxia at the time, but he was really interested in motor dysfunction, which is not working correctly. So that was his area of interest. This is why he's often coined as like the father, the OG. We asked the question, how did early 1900s clumsy child syndrome shape our views of child motor issues? What is the legacy of clumsy child syndrome? Has it changed how we see people who might have what we now know as developmental coordination disorder? However, aren't children naturally quite clumsy anyway? Also, have you noticed it's not talking about adults, it's actually just saying children. It might have been believed that only children have dyspraxia/DCD. Absolutely, and that's not ideal, is it? We know that autism as well as ADHD, everyone always thought these were just for children. It's only in genuinely the last couple of decades where we have thought, you know what? This is lifelong. Blaming, discriminating, exclusion, yeah. It's very much putting the emphasis on the individual. Why are you so clumsy? Why you keep falling over? So it's very narrow in focus. On the other hand, though, it's a very illustrative, visual way of talking about something. If you say the word dyspraxia, what does it even mean? It's a word which only relates to that one condition. If you say clumsy child, now I know exactly what I'm dealing with here. And as someone who may be uneducated, you would know how to support someone. The risk of this, though, is it doesn't give you the whole picture. Remember how we were talking about that triad of different impairments? It doesn't account for, say, the organizational side or the sensory stimulation or struggling with processing. We can't grow out of it. So again, labels not very useful. Really hurtful stigma. My friend has dyspraxia, and growing up, he was always labelled clumsy. It is true, sometimes clumsy can be seen as oh, you're so clumsy. Or other times it can be, oh, you are really clumsy, accident prone, Mr. Bump, always bumping into things. Then we're looking at a 30. Mr. Orton, never one to give up on his quest to know everything you can about motor coordination disorders. He declared dyspraxia, so remember, no one has ever used this word yet. He said about one of the 6 most common developmental disorders. Even back in the 30s, we knew that this particular condition was really common, yet we still didn't have a name for it that people agreed upon. Orton teamed up with Gillingham, and they created an approach called the Gillingham method, which is used to support people. So even back then, we were developing strategies in order to support people. Moving on to the mid-20th century. In the mid-20s, we're talking the 40s and the 50s, it's all kicking off. Suddenly, we're actually caring about the brain. We're more into psychiatry at this point in time, though. There's more focus on kids with motor issues. Beforehand, it's not been something that has particularly interested people. Yeah, we had Orton, we had other people who were fascinated by it, but we were talking the minority. The other names started popping up. We had minimal brain dysfunction. Oh, that sounds bad. What's that? Is that worse than clumsy child syndrome? Minimal brain dysfunction. So dysfunction, dys as in not working, function is when something works. So it's saying, you know what? It's not a big deal, but your brain is dysfunctioning. That sounds really negative. But these were popular. This was common knowledge. Clumsy child was also very much embedded into society and day-to-day life. Mr. Goldstein here, Curti, he did a lot of advocating to understand coordination problems. Rather than just accepting it is a thing, we had people who were going out of their way to research it, to understand it, and hopefully, just hopefully, define it, because we still haven't got a concrete definition yet. All the terms that currently exist are far too vague and ultimately not helpful. If you're able to, I want you to rank the terms for understanding motor coordination issues. What of these names are actually useful? So first of all, we got Developmental Coordination Disorder, DCD. This is the one we've settled on at the moment. Doesn't mean it's perfect, but it's the one we currently use. We've got Developmental Dyspraxia, and that's quite a useful one because here we really say, hey, developmental. You could have acquired dyspraxia. We've got disorder of attention and motor perception, DAMP. Now, personally, I don't know about you, I wouldn't want to have a condition called DAMP. Oh, Ladonna says, I have verbal dyspraxia. The older I get, the more I unmask, the worse it gets. We've got different names. We've got DCD, motor learning difficulties. Maybe that learning difficulties, I guess it's a bit nicer. Developmental dyspraxia, developmental Let's look at some of these. We've got disorder, DAMP, sensory motor dysfunction. That one, which is currently in 6th place, that is talking about the fact that it can affect sensory information and motor. We got predocento motor dysfunction. If I'm even struggling to read them, who knows what they mean? Let's actually look at some of the language, because I love a bit of linguistics. Praxis, like dyspraxia, what does it mean? I believe it's Latin, might be Greek, but I think it's Latin by the XIS on the end. It's about ideation. How can are you able to think about information? It's about planning, how you order information. And it's also about the execution, so the end result. Those with praxis, they will be thinking of what they want to do. They will also be able to organize how they do it, and they're actually doing it. Praxia, this just means different from the ordinary, or not able to do something. When we put those two words together, the actual name dyspraxia actually makes a lot of sense, because it is saying it's someone who struggles to come up with ideas, to plan the ideas, and to actually do the ideas. While it is still quite narrow in its scope, I actually prefer the term, where developmental coordination disorder is a bit more narrow, but what it does do is really hit home the fact that this is something that is with you your entire life, which dyspraxia just doesn't do. There's this great quote from Annell, and this was her describing what we now know to be dyspraxia in the 40s. She said, "Awkward in movement, poor at games, hopeless in dancing and gymnastics, a bad writer, oh dear, defective in concentration. He is inattentive, cannot sit still, leaves his shoelaces untied, does buttons wrongly, and bump into furniture." Ugh, Anna, what a misery guts. Not exactly the most empowering, but she is talking about what we now know as developmental coordination disorder. We just haven't been able to put a name to it that we actually agree upon. Now we're going on to the swinging 60s and the groovy 70s. I don't know what we call the 70s. This is where we're actually coming up with a name. And this is where America takes over. They got to the moon. They also started developing dyspraxia more. Good on them. Pure motor dysfunction includes sensory and motor issues. So we're coming up with names that are actually more accurate. You know what they say? It does what it says on the tin. We're including sensory information, which poor dyspraxia, people never know about. If people have heard of dyspraxia, they think it's all about movement. But it is also about sensory information. In 1962, the term DCD was adopted. It still feels new, doesn't it? When people say, oh, developmental coordination disorder, you think, oh, is that like a new word to replace dyspraxia? It's been around for a long time. It just hasn't been adopted that well. Once when I was at my mate's wedding, I was playing rounders, and rather than hit the ball, I let go of the bat and it knocked off the bride's brother's ear, and it was blood everywhere. It was a nightmare. It can definitely get you in some sticky situations. Even in the clumsy child syndrome was widely used. This was what most people used, but it wasn't a good term. This person called Gubbe, who we'll talk a bit more about soon, is the reason we get bullied in the playground. Damn you, Gubbe. As we're talking about the damn clumsy child syndrome, Gumbe only wrote a bloody book about it, and this book was widely read. This is why the name really stuck around. Don't like the clumsy name, forget about it. Moving on to the 80s, which was a lovely year. There was formal recognition and criteria. Suddenly, we're actually getting scientific. We're not just putting names out willy-nilly. We've got names that actually make sense. So, just emerged in the 80s. So yeah, believe it or not, the term DCD came before dyspraxia, and yet people always think it's the other way round. We started questioning, looking at intelligent mandate, advocating and comparing. Long story short, it doesn't affect intelligence. Dyspraxia doesn't mean you're smart nor dumb, it's not related to intelligence. The Dyspraxia Foundation, which was known as the Dyspraxia Trust, was established. However, for those of you who do not know, it recently collapsed. Yeah, the Dyspraxia Foundation, dead as a dodo. But it did amazing work for a good amount of years, so thank you, Dyspraxia Foundation. And yay, by the end of the 80s, the clumsy child syndrome, we got rid of it. Now, people still use it, but in terms of like in a medical, professional settings, forget about it. It's dead to us. And for the right, because it's not just clumsiness, it's not just in children, maybe a syndrome, but the name wasn't helpful. This is a little bit of a fun question, not fun question, because are governments doing enough for dyspraxia? Clearly not. And this is something which they need to be doing things. It's really common, but interest after the, 60s and 70s, interest of dyspraxia has dipped. So much so that the main foundation which advocates for dyspraxia is no more because it wasn't financially viable. We need to step our game up. I'm not just talking about one government, all governments need to step their game up on dyspraxia. And this comes down to talking about whether or not we believe, should it be classed as a disability? Did you know this used to be included in the Paralympics? So I could have been an Olympian. I could have done the distance, but they got rid of it because we weren't disabled enough. We're too disabled to actually be in the Olympics, but not disabled enough to be in the Paralympics. Where do we fit? We got to agree, yeah. So it's a tricky one where we lie, because remember originally it was called like minor brain dysfunction. It's never been seen as a terrible condition, but it's still something which impacts day-to-day life. In the 90s, the old Dyspraxia Trust got a nice rebrand, a new coat of paint, and now it is a foundation. I don't know legally if there's a difference between trust and foundation, but it means it's evolving, people are taking notice, and the starts actually writing it down. But we are going beyond just looking at it from a psychiatry perspective and also looking at it from genetics. Essentially, it's not just looking at this person's being a bit clumsy. We're also saying, wait a sec, there's something in your brain which matches someone else's brain, which matches someone else's brain, which we've all said has dyspraxia. We know dyspraxia is hereditary. It does run in families. There is a genetic element to it. We are still a long way off to really understanding it. For instance, we have no idea about biomarkers yet. Biomarkers is something in the brain which says, that's 100% dyspraxia. We don't have that yet, but there are definitely overlaps and things which make us think there's something there. We just need to do a bit more research. In terms of organisations, I did mention, unfortunately, we lost the Dyspraxia Foundation. RIP. Genuinely a massive loss. They were a great organisation. Now, we've got exceptional individuals, which is us. We don't specialise in dyspraxia. We're a bit more broader than that, but we still have a lot of expertise in it. I'm not saying we are a substitute for Dyspraxia Foundation, but we are available. Then we got Dyspraxia UK, which is much smaller. Dyspraxic Me, which I was a trustee of many years, is just a small peer support group for young adults, I think around about 18 and 26 with dyspraxia. Then you got the Dyspraxia Foundation USA. As you can see, the number of organizations out there to support people with dyspraxia is very minimal. We are looking at so fMRIs, DTI, essentially brain scans, are starting to understand what the DCD brain actually involves. So we know for 100% there is different wiring in the brain. But in terms of understanding the exact genetics, we do not know. It is just like autism, a spectrum. And because it affects people so differently, it's really difficult to pinpoint exactly what is dyspraxia on a neurological level. We do know from genetic studies that it is heritable, which means it runs in the family. And there are potential markers for motor issues. If you have no idea what we mean by markers, it's essentially, is there like something which if you were to do a brain scan and you would see that marker, even though it's like ridiculously tiny, would that say, yep, dyspraxia? There are definitely things which indicate dyspraxia, but we haven't honed it down to one thing. Originally, the DSM-5, which is our current edition for diagnosing people in the US and other countries, that was meant to be purely based on neuroscience and biomarkers rather than psychiatry, which is observations. Unfortunately, the science wasn't there yet. So ideally, the next DSM or ICD, whatever statistical manual we use, will be neuroscience focused. We are still a little bit off from that yet because we haven't successfully been able to concrete find biomarkers. That being said, there is a lot of hope and potential in AI. I know everything's AI at the moment, but with studies with autism, they found, I think it was like a 95% accuracy rate in diagnosing autism. Obviously, this is just tests at the moment, but I imagine a similar thing could be done for dyspraxia. Now we're in modern day. People know about dyspraxia more or less. It's becoming public knowledge. We even had someone with dyspraxia in Doctor Who. I'm sorry, Jodie, you weren't a great doctor. But either way, they were talking about dyspraxia. I quite like the new Doctor Who. I don't know about you, but I think it's quite fun. So we've got people talking about therapies and education. We've got general acknowledgement in actual manuals, which people respect. And we've also got advocacy by groups like DCD UK and Dyspraxia Foundation that had made massive headways in understanding. We've got people in movies who arguably have been based around those with dyspraxia. Now, we've talked about dyspraxia in media before. It is a little bit two-dimensional. So, for instance, just Clumsy, but you get the gist. I think, for instance, Bridget Jones and Neville Longbottom are great examples of people with dyspraxia. Yeah, a little bit of a mess, but they have amazing empathy and great interpersonal skills. And I think they show people a more three-dimensional way. Then we've got celebrities which are actually talking about dyspraxia. So who do we have here? Ooh, let's see which one. So they are all, apart from David Beckham, OC, the others have dyspraxia. We've got Daniel Radcliffe, Harry Potter, David Bailey, a famous photographer, Cara Delevingne, the English model. People are openly talking about it. What other people do we have that have dyspraxia? Florence Welch from Machines, Tom Daley, the swimmer, Will Porter, or Ellis Genge, the rugby player. I didn't actually know who he was until I did today. But we've got a lot of great examples of people with dyspraxia now. And we're showing that it doesn't just have to be deficit focused. So we are definitely moving from awareness to acceptance. And the next stage, I believe, is utilizing that unique ability and difference. In 2010, the Equality Act essentially homed in that being dyspraxic is a disability and that you are covered and that you do have rights to get support in the workplace. But what does the future look like? AI is going to play a big part in terms of understanding the brain. What it does is it takes hundreds and thousands and millions of pictures of the brain that we have, and it will look for similarities that the human eye cannot see. And that is what we're going to be looking for, biomarkers. We're also going to be looking at gene editing. Could we get rid of dyspraxia? I hope not, because there's lots of benefits that come with it, but we're going to be asking those questions. We've also noted that reading has accelerated. So people with dyspraxia are far better in the things they used to find difficult. they're now going to keep doing better and better at because we've got better support strategies. So the future is looking really positive. But we also have things like the Dyspraxia Foundation shutting down, which also shows you a lack of funding in the area. So while there is lots to be positive about, we've still got to keep our eye on the ball and not take anything for given or for granted. Should we have a cure for dyspraxia? No, I think we should be supporting people on how to get the best out of their lives rather than trying to cure something that doesn't need a cure. Those with dyspraxia, it's just a different way of processing information where some things are inherently more easy and other things are more challenging. We need to adapt our systems and societies as the key thing. So yeah, let's keep researching dyspraxia, but there's more important things to do than just look at a cure, because essentially it's part of your DNA, it's who you are. We've also got ethical questions that are going to be coming up, which I think are fascinating. So, for instance, would you have your DNA analyzed for dyspraxia? If you could find out if you 100% have it or don't have it, rather than maybe I do, would you do it? Would you feel comfortable with dyspraxia being seen as a genetic mutation rather than a disorder? That's interesting because with looking at genetics, technically, maybe it is a mutation. A mutation doesn't have to be a bad thing, by the way. Am I like an X-Men mutant? No, but it makes you realize that maybe there are names that are more accurate. Should parents start screening for dyspraxia in pregnancy? See, this is where it gets a bit iffy because if you know in advance, you can learn about it and make amendments. Great. But if you know about it, people might be inclined to get rid of that cognitive diversity before it even comes into existence. So we've got all these questions which we're going to have to be asking us the more we understand about the genetics of it. So there are pros and cons to wherever we're heading in time and space. Now, the last things just to discuss, we're going to be looking at early diagnosis and interventions. I would say that's far more critical than going down the neuroscience. Don't get me wrong, neuroscience is sexy, but is it that useful in this sector at the moment? Probably not. Research is going to continue onto the biological basis of DCD, so looking at those biomarkers. We're also going to be doing way more research on comorbidities and long-term impacts. How does dyspraxia relate to autism? How does it relate to depression? How does it relate to genius? We're also going to be using much more technology like VR and different assisted therapies in order to benefit many more people at a much reduced cost. So yes, the history of dyspraxia isn't that long. Yes, it has been pretty deficit focused, but I do think we are going places. So there is lots to be positive about. If any of you are like, you know what, now I have dyspraxia, I can't wait for the future, times are ticking, you can get a workplace needs assessment today. So all you need to do is go on our website and we can make sure you get support in the workplace. But who cares? The most important thing is, do you require support in the workplace? If yes, you are eligible for it, even if you have no bit of paper to prove that you have XYZ anyway. So do get in touch. Believe it or not, this has all been referenced today and come from legit sources. Feel free to check them out if you want to take a deep dive. And do know that you can go on our website where we have much more information on dyspraxia and DCD, or you can go and drop us a message and we're always happy to reply and talk to you. And we are done. Oof. But thank you everyone for sticking with me. Great stuff, everyone. Really appreciate you all sticking with it. And as I said, we do have lots more on our website and other YouTube videos which talk about dyspraxia for more information. But have a good rest of your Thursdays, okay? What one do we have for next week? We have a history of OCD next week. So yeah, we've never done one on that before. So check it out. All right. Bye, everyone.